Ellie Harmon had established two unshakable rules for guiding strangers through the unforgiving backcountry. She demanded blind ignorance regarding why her clients needed to vanish for 48 hours, and she maintained a frigid emotional distance from whoever was signing her paychecks. Ellie had absolutely no trouble enforcing the first condition. The wilderness didn't care about secrets. Yet that second crucial boundary crumbled halfway through their first afternoon. The man dismounted his horse right in the middle of the trail, sinking onto a moss-slicked rock beside the rushing river. He stared into the churning water with a hollow, haunted intensity, a profound exhaustion that seeped far beneath his muscles and settled directly into his bones. It is a heartbreaking thing to witness, a person completely suffocated by their own existence, desperate to shed their own skin. She ought to have nudged her mare forward and left him to his ghosts, but the reins went slack in her hands. "You planning on moving anytime soon?" she asked, her voice cutting through the steady roar of the rapids as she pulled her horse to a halt. "Not particularly," he murmured, keeping his gaze locked on the foam. "Is that a problem?" "Depends entirely on whether you prefer making camp in pitch black or by daylight." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, before he finally pushed himself to his feet with the agonizing reluctance of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. "Lead the way." As a storyteller, there is an aching vulnerability I feel when observing these pivotal collisions of fate. When a guarded soul accidentally drops its shield, the air shifts. Ellie found herself helplessly caught in that intimate crossfire, suddenly burdened with a profound, unspoken knowledge of a man she barely knew. He offered only a first name, and she demanded nothing more. They spent 2 nights huddled around a modest fire tucked deep within the jagged peaks of the Tennessee mountains. It was a vast, consuming silence, the kind of pure, breathless isolation that concrete cities spend decades trying to artificially replicate. By the second night, the flames had burned down to glowing amber embers, casting long, dancing shadows while neither of them made the slightest attempt to retreat to their bedrolls. "You always live out here?" he asked, his voice a low rumble blending with the crackling wood. "Born and raised." She casually stoked the coals with a stick, watching a flurry of sparks rise into the crisp night air. "You?" "Milan. Long way to travel just to sit on a rock." The corner of his mouth twitched into a fragile half-smile. "My doctor told me I needed to stop. I just couldn't figure out how to do that anywhere I recognized." That was the moment Ellie truly looked at him. She absorbed the sight of his custom-tailored jacket, completely out of place yet draped over his frame like armor. She noticed the brutal tension grinding in his jaw, recognizing the unmistakable posture of a man who suffered in absolute solitude by choice rather than necessity. When their eyes met, she found herself trapped in a piercing blue gaze. He was dissecting her just as ruthlessly as she was dissecting him, stripping away her defenses. "What are you carrying?" she asked, her voice softening to barely a whisper. He held her stare for an eternity before the dam finally broke. The words bled out of him into the darkness. He spoke of his father, of an oppressive legacy that suffocated him far more than any inherited fortune ever could, and of a powerful family name that demanded his absolute surrender long before he even understood his own identity. "My heart aches for these quiet prisoners of wealth, trapped in golden cages built by their ancestors." In return, she offered him the raw truth of her ranch. She spoke of the grandmother who had bequeathed her the sprawling land and an equally massive dose of pure stubbornness. She confessed the endless exhaustion of mending broken fences, the crushing tide of unpaid bills, and that fierce, irrational pride swelling in her chest every single morning when she stepped onto the frost-covered grass and realized the dirt beneath her boots still belonged to her. Their connection ignited with a reckless, devastating inevitability, bypassing all logic and caution to become a tragic collision of two desperate souls. As the fire died down to a final glowing pulse, she reached across the small distance between them to take his empty coffee mug. Their hands brushed. It was the briefest friction of skin against skin, yet the spark it ignited was dangerous, impossible to extinguish. He looked down at their hands, then up into her eyes, and whatever restraint had kept them anchored instantly evaporated. The kiss didn't start tentatively. It struck like sudden lightning, born of shared exhaustion and a desperate, starving hunger for something real. My pulse quickens just remembering how they clung to each other in that freezing darkness, shedding their burdens along with their heavy coats. It wasn't just physical surrender. It was a profound act of salvation. The cold mountain air was forgotten against the blistering heat of their shared intimacy, tangling them together in a raw, unspoken promise that neither of them would be capable of keeping. When the biting morning chill woke her on the third day, a dreadful emptiness clawed at my chest as I watched her emerge from the tangled blankets. She was completely alone. His tent lay collapsed. His horse vanished into the mist. He left no note, no contact number, and no surname to track down. All that remained of him were deep hoofprints pressed into the damp mud, the lingering scent of cedar and sweat on her skin, and a sickening, hollow ache. I could feel her quiet devastation, the agonizing realization that surrendering everything in those fleeting hours had exacted a price far steeper than her fragile heart could afford. We always desperately want to believe that the universe will offer us a warning before shattering our reality, a cosmic sign to brace for impact. Ellie Harmon received absolutely none, yet 4 long years later, when fate finally returned to collect the exorbitant debt of those 2 isolated days, the chilling truth crystallized. The tragedy was never his sudden disappearance into the mountains. The true catastrophe lay entirely in the unseen, life-altering consequences he had left growing in his wake. The Harmon Ranch was a modest, sprawling stretch of weather-beaten wood and rolling pastures. I always marvel at how places like this trap time within their walls. The old farmhouse still carried the comforting, roasted aroma of her grandmother's morning coffee, clinging to the floorboards decades later. Ellie had inherited the sprawling acres, the 6 restless horses, and an ironclad stubbornness that flowed far thicker than blood in her veins. Jackson sat perched atop Biscuit, the most even-tempered gelding on the property, proudly gripping the reins as Ellie stepped onto the creaking porch with her steaming mug. "Sit up straight," she called out, her voice carrying the gentle, fierce protection that only a mother possesses. "Back straight, baby." He immediately corrected his posture, thrusting his tiny chest forward with the immense, solemn gravity of a 3-year-old who firmly believed he was taming a wild stallion. She quickly ducked her head, hiding a tender smile behind the rim of her mug. There is a profound, subtle cruelty in the mundane. It was a morning painted in the quiet, unremarkable strokes of everyday life. I find it agonizing how the universe offers no drumroll, no sudden shift in the wind before tearing your entire world to shreds. She would later spend countless sleepless nights returning to this exact fragile hour, haunted by how peaceful the precipice felt right before the devastating fall. Barely a mile away, where the dusty county road traced the property line, a sleek, ominous town car crept along the gravel before rolling to a heavy, deliberate halt. Matteo Conti had descended upon Tennessee armed with a surgically precise agenda: execute the acquisition documents for the Conti Group, endure 2 local meetings, and board his private jet back to Milan by Thursday. His entire existence was a monument to clinical efficiency, scrubbed completely clean of messy human complications. Yet, all reason completely evaporated as he stared through the tinted glass. He jammed his foot on the brake without a single rational thought to justify it. His gaze was anchored onto the small boy sitting upright on the chestnut horse near the splintered fence. It felt as though an invisible rusted gear deep within Matteo's chest had violently locked into place, seizing his lungs. It was the boy's eyes. They were a piercing, unmistakable blue, his exact shade of blue, staring back from the innocent face of a total stranger. There are rare, terrifying moments in a lifetime when the human brain simply shorts out, utterly refusing to process an impossible reality. The shock bypasses all logic, striking directly at the primitive core of the soul and burying itself in the ribs like a lead weight. My breath catches just witnessing him sit there, completely paralyzed by the impossible. Matteo was trapped in that terrifying suspension of gravity. Ellie lifted her head from her coffee, the hairs on her arms standing up as she spotted the unfamiliar vehicle idling on the boundary line. The heavily tinted windows offered no answers, only a sleek, predatory reflection of the surrounding hills, flanked by out-of-state plates. They remained suspended in that eerie tableau for 10 suffocating seconds, Ellie staring down the phantom car, Jackson blissfully unaware atop his gentle mount, the morning air thick and perfectly still. Then the engine revved, and the vehicle slithered away into a cloud of pale dust. A cold prickle of unease crawled up the back of her neck, locking her boots to the porch boards for a fraction of a second too long. Finally, she forced herself to shake off the chill, setting her mug down with a sharp clack before calling Jackson in for breakfast. She fiercely refused to waste precious daylight obsessing over a lost tourist. Survival left no room for paranoia. She had a sagging southern fence line demanding her attention, a towering stack of veterinary bills gathering dust on the kitchen counter, and a fragile livelihood that absolutely required her feet planted firmly in the dirt. Tragedy rarely announces its arrival with fanfare. It slips through the cracks of an ordinary afternoon. Just hours later, the fragile peace of the ranch violently shattered. Jackson had climbed the lower rung of the paddock to offer Biscuit a handful of sweet feed, a harmless daily ritual. But a sudden, deafening backfire from a passing logging truck down the county road sent the gelding into a blind panic. The massive animal reared, its heavy flank slamming against the wooden rails. The sickening crack of splintering wood was immediately followed by the terrifying, breathless thud of a small body hitting the compacted dirt. My chest tightens, just recalling the sheer, blinding horror that paralyzed Ellie as she dropped her tools. The peaceful afternoon instantly warped into a living nightmare as she sprinted toward her motionless child, the dust settling around his fragile frame. Hours later, locked inside his sterile hotel suite, Matteo sat paralyzed in an armchair by the window, his laptop remaining cold and sealed on the desk. 14 urgent messages from the Milan office piled up on his silenced phone, each notification flashing uselessly in the dimming light. He merely sat there, haunted by those impossible blue eyes burning from the face of a rural Tennessee child. His brilliant, mathematically driven mind furiously calculated variables, desperately trying to construct a rational, biological excuse for the phantom ache taking over his body. Every single equation failed. The oppressive silence of the room shattered at exactly 11:20 that night. The glowing screen displayed an unknown Tennessee number. He snatched it up on the second ring, his pulse hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against his throat. "Mr. Conti?" The woman's voice on the other end was unnervingly composed for such a late hour, carrying that practiced, clinical neutrality cultivated by those who deliver nightmares for a living. "This is Clarksburg Community Hospital. You are listed as the biological father of Jackson Harmon. We need you to come in immediately." For 3 agonizing seconds, the axis of the earth stopped spinning. The oxygen simply vanished from his lungs. "I'm on my way," he rasped. Pride is a magnificently deceptive armor when the skies are clear. It is a fierce, motivating force when the mortgage clears, when the pasture fences hold strong against the wind, and when a child is resting safely down the hall. It forces you out of bed before dawn and builds walls that keep the rest of the world at a safe, manageable distance. Yet, when tragedy strikes, pride becomes a lethal liability. Ellie Harmon collided with that devastating truth at exactly 8 o'clock on a Thursday night. The attending physician delivered a clinical, suffocating blow. Jackson desperately needed a transfusion to survive. His blood type was exceptionally rare. She was biologically incompatible, and they had absolutely no choice but to immediately locate his biological father. The entire world shrank down to a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway cast a sickly, sterile pallor over the linoleum, and the biting chemical stench of bleach and iodine burned the back of her throat. Ellie could hear nothing but the frantic, erratic hammering of her own pulse against her eardrums. "Do you have the father's contact information?" The doctor pressed. She did. She had hoarded his identity inside a battered notebook tucked deep beneath her mattress since Jackson was merely 2 months old. I feel the bitter irony of that memory. It was penned during a fleeting 3:00 a.m. vulnerability, acknowledging the terrifying reality that survival occasionally demanded surrender. She had braced herself for financial ruin or a broken bone, never this creeping phantom of death. "Matteo Conti," she stated, locking her jaw so fiercely her teeth ached to ensure the syllables remained perfectly steady. "Conti, Italian citizen, look him up." As the doctor vanished down the corridor, Ellie slumped heavily against the freezing plaster. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, embodying the desperate posture of a woman trying to hold a shattering universe together by sheer force of will. 40 excruciating minutes later, Matteo materialized through the sliding glass doors. He wore the same immaculate tailoring, though the silk tie hung loose around his collar, and his normally pristine hair lay disheveled, a glaring testament to a man who had abandoned a boardroom in absolute panic. He strode down the wing with an inherited commanding authority that parted the sea of nurses, barking an inquiry to the front desk in sharp, heavily accented English before turning on his heel. Then he saw her. His momentum violently collapsed. 4 grueling years had carved themselves into Ellie's features. The sun and stress had weathered her, casting a guarded, impenetrable toughness over her face. Yet he instantly recognized the same deep, blazing amber eyes that had quietly unraveled him beside a mountain campfire. Ellie remained physically fused to the wall, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "He requires a transfusion," she commanded, slicing through the heavy air before he could even draw a breath to speak. "Extremely rare type. You are the only viable match I can access tonight. That is the only thing that matters in this hallway." She delivered the brutal facts like a seasoned soldier, deploying every last shred of her fractured composure as a shield against the ghosts of their past. Matteo absorbed the impact of her words, his piercing gaze lingering on her face for a dangerous, suspended second, registering the immense weight of her desperation. "Where do I sign?" he murmured. Framed by the oversized rails of the pediatric bed, Jackson looked heartbreakingly tiny. Matteo paused at the threshold, inhaling a ragged, shallow breath as if bracing for a physical blow, desperately attempting to realign the tectonic plates shifting inside his chest. The boy lay awake, staring upward with wide, glassy eyes, his fragile arm tethered to a nest of plastic IV tubing. He wore the solemn, profound expression of an innocent soul who senses the gravity of the room without comprehending the danger. As Matteo crossed the linoleum, Jackson slowly turned his head, fixing the towering stranger with an unfiltered, innocent clarity. "You're the man from the fence," the child whispered. Matteo froze entirely, as if struck by lightning. "I am," he choked out, the response scraping past a massive lump in his throat. Jackson absorbed the confirmation with absolute pure acceptance, instantly closing his heavy eyelids, soothed by a logic only a toddler could possess. There is an indescribable, agonizing tragedy in watching 2 halves of a fractured soul find each other under the harshest fluorescent lights. From the agonizing distance of the corridor, Ellie witnessed the very man she had spent over 1,000 days fiercely trying to erase walk into that sterile room and sit beside the child he never knew existed. And the most devastating part, the knife twist that brought tears to my own eyes as I watched her, was seeing the little boy's tense muscles completely melt into the mattress, finding sudden, instinctive sanctuary in the presence of a complete stranger. Ellie observed the quiet reunion through the thick observation glass, her arms clamped defensively across her ribs, her unblinking stare burning into the scene. She fiercely insisted to herself that her heart remained stone, but the single, burning tear escaping down her cheek betrayed the absolute ruin of her carefully constructed armor. Jackson finally surrendered to exhaustion near midnight. Matteo remained anchored to the hard plastic chair beside the bed, watching intently until the boy's breathing fell into a deep, unbroken rhythm. It was the peaceful, heavy slumber of a child whose innocence still protected him from the crushing weight of the world. Finally he stood, his large hands reaching out to pull the thin hospital blanket over the boy's shoulders. The gesture was stiff and entirely unpracticed, yet vibrating with a profound, terrifying new instinct. Stepping out into the desolate corridor, he found Ellie standing absolute watch. "The doctor assured me he's going to pull through," Matteo offered softly. "I heard him." She clung fiercely to a crushed paper cup of coffee that had turned to ice hours ago. Then why are you still hovering out here? Because my entire life is lying in that bed. The sheer venom in her tone was designed to draw blood, a desperate attempt to push away the suffocating vulnerability threatening to drown her. Matteo absorbed the blow, his jaw tightening under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Ellie," he began, his voice a dangerous, restrained gravel. "When were you planning to tell me I was a father?" I tried. That is an excuse, not an answer. It is the absolute truth. And it's all you are getting from me tonight. She spun on her heel, marching toward the desolate waiting area at the far end of the wing. Driven by a gravity neither of them could resist, he followed in her wake. They collapsed into opposing plastic chairs, separated by a scarred laminate table that felt as vast as an ocean. "You truly intended to raise my child completely alone," Matteo stated, the words stripping away his usual boardroom dominance, leaving only the raw, aching confusion of a man trying to comprehend his own ghost. "I am raising him alone," she corrected, her eyes blazing like wildfire. "There is a massive difference. I had a fundamental right to know him." "You vanished into the mist," the memory ripped through her throat, sharp and unhealed. No forwarding number, no surname to trace, no breadcrumbs. Exactly what was my next move supposed to be? "You could have searched for me." "I did search." The fracture in her voice was devastating. It bypassed anger completely, revealing a deep, rotting core of pure heartbreak. Matteo caught the subtle shift immediately. "What does that mean, Ellie?" She violently shook her head, desperate to cage the memories threatening to spill over. "It is ancient history. It matters everything to me. A staggering amount of things that matter to you tend to show up 4 years too late, Matteo. There is a unique, agonizing torture in facing an adversary who refuses to strike back. It would have been infinitely easier if he had screamed, if he had acted the part of the arrogant, entitled billionaire. Instead, he simply sat there bleeding, radiating genuine remorse. I can feel the excruciating trap she was caught in, the desperate urge to lower just 1 inch of her ironclad defenses battling the terrifying certainty that if she dropped a single brick, her entire universe would collapse. A nurse suddenly pushed through the swinging doors, announcing that Jackson was stirring and crying out for his mother. Ellie shot to her feet, abandoning the crushed cup on the table. She was halfway down the bleak corridor when his voice anchored her to the floor. "I am not leaving Tennessee without knowing my son." She froze, her spine rigid, refusing to grant him the dignity of turning around. "He has no idea who you are." "I'm painfully aware of that," he replied, the words steeped in a profound, unwavering resolve. "I am asking for the opportunity to change it." Silence flooded the hallway, as dense and suffocating as the pitch-black wilderness pressing against the hospital windows. Then, drawing a sharp breath, she resumed her march, leaving him standing in the ruins of the life he never knew he had abandoned. Hours later, the adrenaline finally receded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Curled into the unforgiving armchair beside Jackson's bed, she listened to the rhythmic hum of the machines, but whenever she closed her heavy eyelids, she didn't see the monitors. Her mind relentlessly replayed the image of Matteo's large, trembling hands pulling the blanket over their boy. That single, awkward gesture had been agonizingly tender and undeniably real. She fiercely willed herself to banish the memory, terrified of the dangerous seed of hope it planted in her chest. But the seed was already there, taking root in the dark. 3 agonizing days later, Jackson finally came home. The suffocating, sterile hospital air was instantly replaced by the sweet, dusty scent of sun-baked hay. He was perfectly healthy. The pediatricians swore by it. The complex blood panels confirmed it. And Jackson himself loudly proclaimed his absolute recovery, fiercely offended by his forced exile from the stables. Ellie brought him back to the ranch on a golden Tuesday morning, settling him onto the porch swing with a cold juice box and a woven blanket. For one dangerously naive second, she allowed herself to believe that her fractured reality could be pieced back together. The ominous crunch of heavy tires on gravel violently shattered that illusion. A sleek, black town car materialized in her driveway that afternoon. Matteo emerged completely alone, having abandoned his driver and assistants. He stood there in a sharp charcoal jacket, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his dark eyes sweeping over the weathered barn and sagging fences with an impenetrable heavy stillness. "You could have called," she announced from the top of the porch steps, wiping her damp palms on her denim jeans. "You would have ignored the ring." The absolute certainty in his voice left no room for argument. "Jackson is resting," she warned. "Whatever business you brought to my property, keep your voice down." "Of course," he agreed, stopping at the base of the wooden stairs. He tilted his head, the harsh sunlight catching the rigid angles of his jaw. "Can we talk?" They sat shoulder to shoulder on the creaking porch. The sprawling acreage stretched out before them, wrapped in a suffocating silence that neither dared to break. The summer cicadas hummed in the background, a sharp contrast to the Cold War brewing on the wood planks. Slowly, he withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope from his breast pocket and placed it precisely on the railing between them. She stared at it, her instincts screaming not to touch the venomous thing. "What is that?" "Documents drafted by my legal team." His tone remained meticulously leveled. "I intend for Jackson to carry the Conti name. I demand a permanent legal presence in his life. I refuse to be relegated to a distant ghost who parachutes in twice a year. And what exactly does a stack of legal paper have to do with being a father?" "Ellie." He pivoted his body to face her completely, the mask of the untouchable billionaire slipping just enough to reveal a desperate man. "My family operates under crushing expectations. The Conti Group is navigating a volatile transition, and board members are scrutinizing my every breath. An illegitimate heir creates disastrous vulnerabilities that—" "I am not a corporate vulnerability," she snapped, her amber eyes flashing with dangerous heat. "I am well aware of that." A muscle feathered along his cheekbone. "That is absolutely not what I meant." "It is exactly what that envelope implies." A heavy, loaded pause stretched between them. "I want you to marry me." The declaration crashed into the humid Tennessee afternoon like a boulder plummeting from a great height, instantly suffocating the air around them. Ellie stared at him, the breath violently punched from her lungs. "Excuse me? I know exactly how this sounds." He rushed the words, his heavily guarded composure finally fracturing to expose raw, unfiltered panic. "I realize this is a terrible way to ask. But I have a son I didn't know existed 4 days ago. I refuse to return to Milan and abandon him. The absolute only method to protect him, and to shield you from the ruthless warfare my family is capable of unleashing, is if we legitimize this arrangement immediately." "Legitimize," she repeated, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. "You mean control the narrative. I mean keeping Jackson completely safe. There is a terrifying, inescapable trap hidden within undeniable logic." I watched her struggle against the invisible chains he was wrapping around her life. The most devastating part of his brutal ultimatum bypassed his immense wealth and his terrifying corporate power. The true horror was the sickening realization that he was absolutely right. Refusing him meant exposing her child to the wolves. She reached out and took the envelope. The heavy cardstock felt like a death warrant in her calloused hands. She absorbed every single line, every restrictive clause, her jaw locked in iron defiance. Her eyes remained dead and steady, refusing to surrender a single flinch or gasp of outrage. When she finally reached the bottom page, she placed it back on the railing with a quiet, deliberate tap. "There is something you need to hear," she stated. He waited, the tension radiating off him like heat from a furnace. 4 years ago, after you vanished." She fixed her gaze firmly on the horizon, deliberately avoiding his face. "I discovered I was pregnant. I wrote you a letter. I had managed to hunt down your full name by then, and I mailed it directly to the Conti Group headquarters in Milan." A ragged breath escaped her lips. It bounced back. "The postal service cited an Invalid address. I attempted it twice." Slowly, she turned her head, locking her burning gaze with his. "I never hid this child from you. The universe simply refused to deliver the message." Matteo turned entirely to stone. The profound silence settling over the porch fundamentally mutated. It was no longer the bitter quiet of two enemies locked in combat. It was the devastating, breathless realization of two deeply wounded people discovering they had both been betrayed by fate, entirely rewriting the tragic narrative they had harbored in secret for years. "Ellie!" he choked out, the sound tearing violently from his throat. "I am not telling you this to weaponize your guilt," she interrupted softly. "I am telling you this because if I agree to this madness, you must understand that I never orchestrated this outcome. I never chose this life." He studied her face for an eternity, absorbing the immense, tragic weight of her confession. Then he nodded once, a slow, definitive movement of absolute surrender. "Neither did I." With trembling fingers, she picked up the envelope, and she signed it. Instead of imposing his towering presence directly into the cramped farmhouse, Matteo secured a lease on the sprawling neighboring property, the very estate his corporation had just acquired. He established a temporary residence that completely defied logic, vastly too luxurious for rural Tennessee, yet shockingly Spartan for a man of his exorbitant means. It was a highly calculated, respectful boundary that Ellie acutely observed, though she fiercely guarded her tongue, refusing to acknowledge the concession out loud. The legal arrangement they had drafted was ruthlessly straightforward on paper. Matteo would spend his daylight hours at the Harmon Ranch. Jackson would slowly acclimate to his biological father, and they would flawlessly execute the facade of a unified couple whenever the town's prying eyes demanded it. In exactly 60 days they would bind themselves in marriage. It sounded remarkably simple, neatly structured, and entirely safe. But the ink on the contract completely failed to calculate the chaotic, gravity-altering variable that was Jackson. "You absolutely have to feed them first thing in the morning," Jackson instructed, his tiny voice vibrating with the solemn gravity of a seasoned general sharing highly classified intelligence. He marched proudly ahead of Matteo down the dusty stable aisle, gesturing grandly at each stall like a miniature overzealous tour guide. "And you cannot yell, because they hate loud noises, especially Biscuit." "Good to know," Matteo murmured, his deep voice carefully modulated to respect the boy's strict parameters. "Do you have horses in Italy?" "Not personally." Jackson processed this tragic information, his little brows knitting together in profound sorrow. "That is kind of sad, is it?" "Biscuit definitely thinks so." He halted abruptly in front of the oldest gelding stall and tilted his head back to study the towering man. "You can pet him. He tolerates strangers, but only if you keep your energy very calm." Matteo slowly crouched down to meet Jackson exactly at eye level. He extended his large, manicured hand toward the massive animal, precisely the way the toddler had demonstrated, keeping his palm perfectly flat and his approach agonizingly slow. A warm, velvet muzzle dropped heavily into his palm, snorting a breath of sweet alfalfa dust over his skin. In that split second, a profound, unnameable warmth violently expanded inside Matteo's chest, fracturing a rigid piece of his carefully constructed armor. "See?" Jackson announced with immense satisfaction. "You're actually pretty okay at it." It is devastatingly easy to become blinded by the cold mechanics of their legal contract, focusing solely on the intimidating power dynamics and the impossible trap Ellie was forced into, while completely missing the quiet miracle unfolding in the dirt. A titan of industry, a man who had sacrificed his entire adult life carrying a bloodline that demanded ruthless perfection, was kneeling in the sawdust of a Tennessee stable, painstakingly learning how to approach a farm animal simply because a 3-year-old deemed it important. This tender obedience doesn't erase the terrifying ultimatum he delivered, nor does it magically untangle the massive knot of their shared history. But there is an undeniable, breathtaking purity to it. It was real, and real things possess a dangerous power to change absolutely everything. Ellie silently approached the barn, stumbling upon the intimate tableau, just as the heavy, golden hour of the Tennessee sunset bled through the open stable doors, casting the space in a warm, nostalgic amber that made the present moment feel instantly like a cherished memory. She remained anchored to the doorframe for far longer than she intended, her heart performing a terrifying, erratic flutter against her ribs as she watched Matteo hang on her son's every word. "Dinner's ready," she finally called out, her voice slightly tighter than usual. Jackson spun around with a brilliant smile. Matteo lifted his gaze, his dark eyes locking onto hers through the dusty air. For a fraction of a second, a fleeting heartbeat, his expression was entirely unguarded, stripped of the billionaire CEO and leaving only the man. Then Jackson grabbed his large hand, forcefully towing him toward the farmhouse, and the delicate spell shattered into the evening breeze. The dinner table vibrated with chaotic energy, dictated entirely by Jackson's boundless curiosity. He interrogated Matteo about the existence of Italian cowboys, aggressively demanded to know if his new father could ride a charging stallion instead of just petting sleepy geldings, and pressed for a professional assessment on whether authentic Italian pizza could possibly rival the greasy slices from the local diner. "I suspect you might find the comparison rather disappointing," Matteo noted, carefully navigating his roasted chicken. "Why?" "Because pizza in Italy is—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic translation. "A remarkably serious matter. People hold very intense opinions about it." "Mama has opinions about absolutely everything," Jackson supplied with cheerful, devastating honesty. Ellie pressed her lips into a thin, white line, praying for the floorboards to miraculously swallow her whole. "Thank you for sharing, baby." "It's okay," Jackson assured her charitably, patting her tense knuckles with a sticky palm. "Grandma used to say that having opinions just means you care a lot." Across the scarred wooden table, Matteo caught Ellie's eye. Amusement danced dangerously in his dark gaze, an unspoken teasing truce hovering in the space between them. She forcefully broke the connection, instantly dropping her attention to her plate. At 11 o'clock that night, an unexpected clatter drew Ellie out of the house. She marched down the gravel path wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan, bracing herself to wrestle with a broken latch or a restless mare. Instead, she found Matteo sitting quietly on a rough hay bale. He had discarded his expensive suit jacket, rolling the crisp sleeves of his dress shirt up to his elbows. He was speaking to Biscuit in a low, rhythmic cadence of fluid Italian, the melodic syllables wrapping around the dark barn like a mesmerizing lullaby. He remained completely oblivious to her presence. She stood frozen in the shadowy doorway, completely paralyzed. She was watching a man whose net worth eclipsed the entire gross domestic product of their county sitting in the dust of her modest stable at midnight, treating an aging horse like a trusted confidant. A terrifying, entirely forbidden warmth bloomed deep within her stomach. Instantly panicked by the sensation, she forcefully locked the feeling away in the darkest corner of her mind. She retreated to the house, slipping back into her empty bed without making a single sound. The boundary fence violently gave way under a torrential, blinding downpour. Two massive wooden posts collapsed simultaneously, sending 3 of the quarter horses into a panicked, frantic frenzy. The slick, freezing mud instantly transformed the pasture into a treacherous nightmare. Ellie stood knee-deep in the muck at 9 o'clock at night, desperately wielding a heavy iron post driver beneath the erratic, sweeping beam of a flashlight. Her muscles burned with the agonizing, relentless determination of a woman who had carried the entire weight of the world on her own shoulders for far too long. She fiercely refused to call for help. Matteo materialized from the biting darkness regardless. "How did you—" "Jackson mentioned the eastern line was loose this morning," he interrupted, effortlessly stripping the heavy iron tool from her numb, freezing fingers. "Where do you need this?" She blinked through the driving rain, completely stunned. East corner. They worked in a heavy, synchronized rhythm beneath the storm. She held the wavering flashlight while he drove the massive wooden posts deep into the earth. He swung the heavy iron with a brutal, focused physical exertion that seemed entirely alien for a man accustomed to climate-controlled boardrooms and luxury suites. Halfway through the grueling labor, he discarded his soaked jacket, revealing the powerful shift of his shoulders beneath his clinging, wet shirt. Ellie's eyes betrayed her, involuntarily tracking the movement despite the freezing downpour. When the final post was securely set in the mud, He leaned his broad back against the wood, breathing heavily as the rain battered his face, and locked his dark eyes on hers. "You completely refuse to ask for help," he observed. "I am perfectly capable of handling my own property. You were drowning out here tonight, Ellie. I was managing the situation. I know." He offered no argument, only a quiet, devastating truth. "I am simply pointing out that you no longer have to." There is a profoundly disarming power in a person who refuses to push. Instead of demanding a surrender or forcing a bitter argument, Matteo simply offered his observation and allowed it to breathe in the heavy rain-soaked air. It is a rare, beautiful kind of grace, and it was precisely that gentle, unyielding grace that finally cracked her iron shell. "My grandmother managed everything alone," Ellie confessed, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the storm. "Her entire life, she always claimed that needing people was a dangerous luxury she could ill afford." "And you internalized that lesson. It kept her alive." "Did it?" She turned her face away, staring out into the pitch-black pasture beyond the newly mended fence. "She died entirely alone on this very property," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. 74 years old, sitting in an empty house. I found her body the following morning." Matteo went absolutely still. "Ellie." "She would have fiercely hated the fuss," she added quickly, desperately trying to patch the emotional leak. "She would have sworn it was the perfect ending, passing away on her own terms, on her own land." She swallowed hard. "I just keep lying awake wondering if she was terrified at the end." The relentless downpour masked the tears she fought to hold back. Somewhere deep within the dry stable, Biscuit shifted his heavy hooves against the sawdust. "My father concealed his terminal illness from me," Matteo revealed after a long, suspended moment. "For 6 excruciating months. He managed every symptom, kept the global business dominating the market, kept me sprinting on the corporate treadmill. And then one afternoon I received a phone call. He was already in the ICU, and the attending physician was throwing around words like final stage." His voice cracked, exposing a canyon of unresolved grief. I never had the chance to ask him anything. All those vital questions I didn't even know to ask while his lungs still drew breath. She turned back to him, her chest aching for the boy trapped inside the billionaire. "He believed he was protecting you. He was protecting the empire." A bitter, hollow pause. "I firmly believe he eventually forgot the difference." The rain showed absolutely no mercy. As the minutes bled together, the careful, measured distance they usually maintained dissolved entirely. They were simply 2 shivering souls with drenched clothes and bleeding ancient wounds huddled together against the overwhelming darkness. "That man on the mountain trail," Ellie murmured quietly. "The stranger who sat on a mossy rock and watched the river rushing by for an hour." He looked down at her. "Is he still hiding in there?" A profound shift fractured Matteo's expression. It bypassed the highly controlled, manicured mask of the boardroom titan, revealing something much older and infinitely more fragile. It was the soul of the man who existed long before the Conti name meant anything to the world. "He never left," he whispered. "He merely got buried under the debris." She stared up at him for a long, defining moment, and then, driven by an instinct she could no longer suppress, she kissed him. It lacked any polished, cinematic grace. It was raw, urgent, and desperate. Her freezing, mud-stained hands gripped his wet jaw, tilting her face up to meet his in a collision of shared exhaustion and undeniable hunger. She executed the kiss with the exact same unceremonious, fierce conviction she applied to every crucial decision in her life. He immediately dragged her against his chest, returning the kiss with a starving intensity. When she finally broke away, her chest heaving and her lips burning, the freezing rain continued to fall. The broken fence stood repaired, and absolutely nothing about their impossible reality had been solved. "That physical lapse does not alter the terms of our contract," she stated, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "I am fully aware." His voice dropped to a low, dangerous gravel, but it profoundly changes other things. She looked at his rain-slicked face for a second longer. "Yeah," she breathed. "It really does. And she turned, escaping back into the safety of the house. His name was Ricci, acting as the senior legal counsel for the Conti Group out of Milan. He arrived on a stifling Thursday afternoon, armed with a slim leather briefcase and the highly practiced, sterile smile of a corporate executioner, a man who delivered devastating news for a living and had long ago lost the capacity to feel its impact. Ellie was out in the glaring sun, hauling a heavy saddle onto Biscuit's back, when the glare of a second luxury town car in the gravel driveway caught her attention. A cold unease immediately settled into her gut. Later, stepping into the dim, quiet kitchen for a glass of ice water, she inadvertently caught the low hum of voices drifting through the cracked window. She truly never intended to eavesdrop, but the clipped, aggressively businesslike cadence of the stranger's voice rooted her to the linoleum. Then Ricci casually dropped the words child's custody terms, and the oxygen instantly evaporated from the room. If the marriage conditions are breached in any capacity, the original documentation grants the Conti Group full authorization to petition for primary custody within Italian jurisdiction. The boy possesses dual heritage, which explicitly gives us— Ricci, Matteo interrupted, his voice a lethal flat line. Stop. Matteo, the board is deeply concerned. If this fragile arrangement collapses— I said stop. I am simply trying to protect— You are trying to protect the corporation. There is a massive difference. It is a cruel psychological trick, the way a person expects their initial reaction to ultimate betrayal to be a surge of pure white-hot anger or blinding terror, some clean, identifiable emotion that can be weaponized into action. Instead, a suffocating, paralyzing grief flooded Ellie's veins. It was the agonizing mourning of a hope that had barely taken its first breath. Against her every survival instinct, she had actually started to believe the illusion. She had clung to the memory of his raw strength by the broken fence in the pouring rain, the tender cadence of Italian whispered to her horse in the dead of night, and the haunted vulnerability in his eyes when he confessed he had never truly left the mountain. She had recklessly allowed herself to believe that the man, not the billionaire, was real. She pushed through the screen door, marching straight into the kitchen. Both men instantly snapped their attention to her. "How long?" she demanded. She forced the words through a throat completely constricted by panic, maintaining a terrifying, unnatural composure. "How long has that hidden clause been buried in the contract?" "Ellie!" Matteo stepped forward, his mask of control finally shattering. "The custody clause." She locked her burning eyes exclusively onto his, ignoring the lawyer entirely. "Was it in the paperwork the day I signed my life away?" A suffocating beat of silence stretched between them. "Yes." The single syllable dropped onto the kitchen floor like a granite tombstone. "Get out," she hissed at Ricci, before turning the full, devastating force of her glare onto Matteo. "You too. Ellie, please let me explain the legality. I said get out of my house. It was a standard legal protection. For Jackson, for the family, for all of us. A legal protection." A sharp, jagged fracture finally split her voice on the last syllable, but she ruthlessly swallowed the sob, locking the agony away behind an iron fortress. "You secretly weaponized my own child as contractual leverage and actually convinced yourself you were protecting him. I swear to you I would never execute that clause. But you could." She closed the distance between them, her tone dropping into the chilling, absolute deadness of a woman whose heart had just flatlined. "You gave yourself the power to steal him, and you lied to my face." She slowly shook her head, tears of pure betrayal finally spilling over her lashes. "That broken man on the mountain trail. I kept desperately searching for him beneath the suits. Maybe he was never real to begin with." She turned her back on him and walked out into the blazing sun. Out in the dusty front yard, Jackson was furiously wielding a crooked branch, deeply immersed in some complex imaginary battle that operated entirely on toddler logic. He paused mid-swing the moment the screen door slammed shut. "Mama?" He absorbed the absolute ruin in her expression with the terrifying, psychic accuracy that only young children possess, bypassing all of her adult defenses in a fraction of a second. "Are you sad?" She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, dragging his small, warm body fiercely against her chest. "I'm okay, baby." Jackson instantly wrapped his chubby arms tightly around her neck, anchoring himself to her with the pure, unconditional certainty of a child who firmly believed that a hug could mend a shattered universe. She clung to him just as desperately, burying her face in his soft hair as she silently broke apart. From the shadows of the kitchen, Matteo watched the devastating scene unfold through the glass, every muscle in his jaw locked in a spasm of pure self-loathing. He turned slowly back to his lawyer. "Tear up the custody clause. Matteo, the board will never permit—" "Tear it to shreds. Draft an entirely new contract without a single mention of it. Tonight." His command lacked any heat. It was the quiet, absolute decree of a king burning his own castle to the ground. "And then you will immediately board a flight back to Milan. If this arrangement sours and you lack that legal safety net, then I burn along with it," Matteo answered. He turned his gaze back to the window, watching Ellie rock their child under the brutal afternoon sun. Some things are worth infinitely more than a safety net. Ricci snapped his briefcase shut and vanished without another word. Out in the dusty yard, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire trajectory of his life had just been violently rewritten, Jackson picked up his crooked branch and went back to fighting his imaginary monsters. The suffocating weight of the previous day drove her from her bed hours before the sun even considered rising. She sought refuge in the stable before dawn. It was the only sanctuary Ellie had ever known when sleep refused to come, a survival tactic ingrained in her since she was 12 years old. Her grandmother had taught her that horses possess an ancient, quiet magic, perfectly capable of absorbing the heavy agonies that humans cannot bring themselves to speak aloud. She stood in the freezing dark. Her freezing fingers tangled deep in Biscuit's coarse mane, her forehead pressed hard against the animal's warm, muscular neck. When the heavy iron hinges of the barn door groaned, she didn't even flinch. "How did you get in?" she asked, her voice hushed in the sacred quiet of the barn. The main gate was unlocked. "I should fix that latch." "You probably should." He stopped a few feet away, maintaining a cautious, respectful distance, acutely aware that he was trespassing on sacred ground. "I need to show you something." She slowly turned. He held a single, crisp sheet of paper. No leather briefcase, no hovering corporate executioner. He set it gently on the scarred wooden workbench beside her, immediately taking a large step backward so she could examine it without feeling his shadow looming over her. The draconian custody clause had vanished. Every thinly veiled threat, every legal chokehold against her, against Jackson, against the very soil of the ranch, completely erased. What remained was a shockingly vulnerable piece of paper. It looked absolutely nothing like the corporate trap she had signed 2 weeks prior. It was simply the humble plea of a father asking for the right to know his son. She read the words twice, her heart hammering a frantic, confused rhythm against her ribs. "When did you do this?" "Last night." "Why?" He met her gaze, standing entirely stripped of his armor. "Because you were absolutely right." His voice was meticulously level, but the raw, bleeding fracture beneath it was impossible to ignore. "I spent my entire existence watching my father sacrifice every shred of his humanity on the altar of the corporation. Every crucial decision, every devastating personal sacrifice, the company always came first. I swore I would never become that man. I truly convinced myself I wasn't. And then you discovered that clause. And when I looked in the mirror, I realized I had become the exact monster I despised." The heavy silence of the stable swallowed his confession, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the horses. "I am not asking you to magically forget what I did," he whispered. "I am not demanding you place your trust in something I haven't earned." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in the dim light. "I'm simply begging for the opportunity to earn it. The true, terrifying leap of faith in this life isn't merely believing that human beings are capable of change. The ultimate test is standing in the freezing dirt and deciding if the man bleeding his heart out in front of you is genuinely transforming, or merely reciting the exact symphony of words he knows will pick the lock on your chest." But standing in that heavy, dust-moated silence, Ellie Harmon's instincts crystallized. She knew exactly which man was looking back at her. That stranger on the mountain trail. She began slowly, searching the dark depths of his eyes. The one who sat on a mossy rock and poured out his grief about his father. The man who stayed awake half the night whispering Italian lullabies to my horse. She held her breath. Was any of that real? Every single second of it. Then why does he keep disappearing into the mist? Matteo absorbed the question, letting it settle into his bones. Because he learned a brutal lesson, he answered finally, the words steeped in ancient sorrow. He learned that the things he dared to care about were always ripped away. So, he built a fortress and simply stopped caring. He survived on numbness. A ragged exhale escaped his lips. And then he drove past a rusted fence in rural Tennessee, looked into the exact same blue eyes he sees in the mirror, and that entire survival strategy instantly collapsed. She studied his face for a long, defining eternity. "I have one final question," she stated. "Anything. If the corporate board declares war, if your powerful family fiercely objects to this union, if the entire city of Milan makes this arrangement a living hell," she held his gaze, demanding the absolute, unfiltered truth. "What do you choose?" He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "I choose this." His voice resonated with a quiet, earth-shattering, absolute certainty. "I choose Jackson. I choose this struggling ranch, this broken fence, and whatever beautiful, terrifying complication we are building together." He stepped closer, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. "I choose you." "My choice has absolutely nothing to do with a piece of paper. I have been choosing you since a campfire in these mountains 4 years ago, and I was simply too much of a coward to leave you a map to find me." The first bruised, grayish light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the barnwood, chasing away the freezing dark. Ellie looked down at the vulnerable document resting on the workbench. Then she looked up at him. "You are going to have to learn how to actually ride a horse," she commanded softly. "No more just petting them over the gate." The impenetrable billionaire completely shattered. In his place stood a man whose face broke open with a blinding, unguarded relief, raw, beautiful, and entirely his own. "I can do that," he promised, a breathless, genuine smile touching his lips. "Jackson will fully expect you to keep up with him on the trails. I will keep up, for the rest of my life." She looked at him for one final heartbeat. Then, completely surrendering to the dawn, she crossed the remaining distance between them. The wedding took place on a breathtaking, golden Saturday in late October. The crisp Tennessee air carried the woodsy scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires, completely washing away any lingering shadows of Milanese boardrooms or ruthless legal contracts. The Harmon Ranch was transformed with that fierce, chaotic warmth that only a small southern town can muster when they decide to celebrate one of their own. Hand-picked wildflowers spilled beautifully out of rustic mason jars, warm amber string lights looped across the weathered pasture fences, and every single neighbor from Clarksburg crammed onto the property. They were a community that fiercely protected its own, and absolutely no one was going to miss this victory. Matteo stood at the makeshift altar with the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. The rigid silk tie, the ultimate symbol of his corporate armor, was entirely absent. Ellie noticed the subtle, deliberate choice immediately, her heart executing a slow, heavy roll against her ribs. "You look exactly like the man from the mountain trail," she whispered. He smiled, a brilliant, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes, entirely free from the calculated restraint of the Conti Empire. "That," he murmured, "was the entire point." Jackson proudly anchored himself directly between them during the vows. He had solemnly requested the central position, and neither adult possessed the heart to deny him. He stood there clutching one of their hands in each of his small, sticky palms. Decked out in his miniature leather boots and a freshly pressed button-down, he spent the ceremony oscillating between treating the officiant's words with immense, squinting gravity and distractedly kicking at a fascinating clump of clover near his toe. When the pastor finally paused, Jackson tugged heavily on Matteo's hand, tilting his head back to meet his father's gaze. "Does this mean you permanently live here now?" "It absolutely does," Matteo swore softly. "With Biscuit?" "With Biscuit," Matteo confirmed, his deep voice thick with an emotion that $1 billion could never buy. Jackson nodded, his universe perfectly aligned. Okay. There is a profound, messy beauty in how this story forged itself from the wreckage. Their journey bypassed any polished cinematic romance entirely. It ignited from a ruthless corporate ultimatum, a hidden custody clause, and a terrified man who wielded lawyers as a shield against his own fragile heart. It grew from 4 agonizing years of silence, a lost letter, and 2 bruised souls who had every logical excuse to build an impenetrable wall between them. Yet, they arrived at this golden afternoon regardless. They achieved this victory through the grueling, everyday courage of choosing something raw and real over the hollow comfort of safety. They built their salvation piece by agonizing peace, in the sterile, terrifying glow of a hospital hallway, in the quiet sawdust of a midnight stable, and in the freezing mud of a broken fence. It is the ultimate tragedy of the human condition that we so often lock away our truest selves, packing our passions into hidden boxes simply because the world deems them impractical, inconvenient, or dangerous. The man Matteo buried beneath a ruthless global empire, the wounded soul who sat on a mossy rock by the rushing river and whispered Italian to weary horses, was always breathing beneath the surface. He simply required a woman stubborn enough to stand in the storm and call him home. And watching them stand there, bathed in the fading Tennessee sun, I am left with the beautiful, terrifying certainty that true salvation is never found in the safe choices. It is found in the dirt, the rain, and the quiet courage to finally stay. 1 year later, the cycle of seasons always carries a profound, comforting rhythm, and October arrived in Tennessee with its familiar woodsy chill. The morning light poured through the stable doors in the exact same golden slant it had for decades. The crisp air smelled of damp earth and sweet alfalfa, and the sprawling pasture fence still stubbornly demanded constant repair. Yet, the atmosphere vibrating across the Harmon Ranch was entirely, beautifully unrecognizable. From the dusty yard, Jackson babbled into a phone, fiercely explaining Biscuit's morning routine to his grandmother in rapid-fire English. Without missing a single beat, he whirled around to shout a question at Matteo in flawless melodic Italian before seamlessly snapping back to English. It was the effortless, breathtaking magic of a child whose universe had expanded so naturally that he never even realized he was building a bridge between 2 entirely different worlds. Ellie sat anchored to the creaking porch steps, the steam from her coffee mug warming her cheeks as she absorbed the chaotic symphony of her family. Matteo emerged from the dark interior of the stable, wiping sawdust from his denim jeans. He caught her lingering gaze and paused in the gravel. "What?" he asked, a slow, devastatingly handsome smirk touching his lips. "Nothing," she murmured, unable to suppress her own beaming smile. "You're actually getting better in the saddle. Jackson insists I still pull hard to the left. You absolutely pull to the left." "I am actively working on it," he promised, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he closed the distance. She shifted slightly on the wooden board, making space. He dropped down heavily beside her, his thigh pressing intimately against hers. They settled into the rare, profound comfort that only exists between 2 souls who have finally surrendered, completely abandoning the exhausting armor they used to wear for the rest of the world. The sprawling acres stretched out before them, bathed in the quiet, ordinary miracle of the autumn sun. Jackson suddenly tore past the porch, mid-explanation to an invisible audience, one leather bootlace completely untied and flapping wildly in the dirt. "Papa!" the boy hollered without slowing his sprint. "Biscuit desperately needs water." "I'll get it!" Matteo hollered back, his voice rich and booming across the pasture. But he made absolutely no move to stand up. He simply remained anchored to the porch step, leaning his broad shoulder heavily against hers. Ellie took a slow sip of her coffee. "Are the suitcases still sitting by the front door?" "Fully packed and waiting," he confirmed, his thumb tracing a gentle, absent-minded circle over her knuckles. "The plane is fueled for tomorrow morning." The sprawling, intimidating shadow of Milan no longer felt like a suffocating cage. He was finally returning to the marble halls of his ancestry, stepping back into the intense gravity of the Conti family to introduce them to the heir they never saw coming. But as he looked at the fiercely independent woman leaning against his ribs and the little boy terrorizing the horses, the terrifying ghost of his corporate past lost every ounce of its power. He was crossing the Atlantic not as a captive billionaire, but as a deeply grounded man bringing his true life to meet his history. The rigid, aristocratic Conti dynasty was completely unprepared for the chaotic, beautiful storm of Jackson Harmon. "Do you think your mother is ready for him?" Ellie asked, a quiet, warm laugh rumbling deep in her chest. "Absolutely unprepared," Matteo murmured, pressing a soft, lingering kiss into her hair. "But they are going to meet him anyway." We are so often conditioned to believe that epic romances must conclude with grand cinematic declarations or sweeping acts of impossible sacrifice. But true salvation is infinitely quieter than that. It is the simple, breathtaking triumph of a man who finally learned to adjust his grip on the reins, and a fiercely independent woman who finally allowed someone else to hold the hammer in the freezing rain. It isn't a fairy tale. It is something infinitely better. It is a life.